Good afternoon. I'm Leslie Davis-Met, Director of the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. Thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a compelling presentation this afternoon. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a few minutes and share with you some words from our friend, Texas State Senator Jose Menendez.
Hi, I'm State Senator Jose Menendez, and I'd like to welcome you to Holocaust Remembrance Week of 2022. I am so pleased you're joining students from across Texas and learning about the Holocaust. I also want to say thank you to the Texas Holocaust Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, to the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, and to all of the partners who've made these educational resources available to schools across the whole state of Texas. In 2019, State Representative Richard Raymond and I collaborated to pass Senate Bill 1828. The bill calls on the governor of the state to designate a Holocaust Remembrance Week in order to educate students about the Holocaust and inspire a sense of responsibility to recognize and uphold human value that helps prevent future atrocities. The bill passed both the House and Senate unanimously. That tells you how important this effort is to all of us. Senate Bill 1828 was made possible because of the persistence of local upstanders who call themselves the Four Ladies in a Car, because of their frequent trips to Austin on a mission to have a state-designated Holocaust Remembrance Week in Texas. They understand that it is a solemn duty to remember the Holocaust and to foster communities of awareness, care, and kindness. You're going to learn the stories of survivors of the Holocaust and about the upstanders whose compassionate actions saved many lives. You too can be heroes by speaking up whenever you witness injustice around you, or create change by working with your neighbors and local leaders to improve your community. I invite you to continue learning year-round about the heroic acts of upstanding. And just like the Four Ladies in a Car, please reach out to your elected officials in order to make a difference. You're always welcome to reach out to me at 210-733-6604. And I want to thank you for joining me today. And I hope you share everything you learned throughout this observation of the Holocaust Remembrance Week with everyone you meet. Have a great day.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. I'm pleased today to introduce to you a friend of the museum, Dr. Roger Barnes. Before I read you his bio, please note that in the chat and Q&A portions of the screen, you'll be able to submit questions throughout the presentation that Dr. Barnes will address for you at the end. Roger C. Barnes, PhD, was professor of sociology at the University of the Incarnate Word. He retired in May 2021 at the time and was made Professor Emeritus of Sociology upon his retirement. Dr. Barnes chaired the Department of Sociology and taught criminology, social movements, sociological theory, sociology of the death penalty, social stratification, social history of civil rights movement, and social history of the Holocaust. He is specialized as both a scholar and social activist on the death penalty. His writings on the death penalty, crime and justice, the civil rights movement, and the Holocaust have appeared in numerous journals, in edited books, and in newspapers. Dr. Barnes taught for 3 years at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was present as a college student in 1970 with prisoners on Arkansas's death row when the Arkansas governor announced that he had commuted all 15 death sentences. Dr. Barnes was the first recipient of the UIW Presidential Teaching Award in 2005. He served as the university's Moody Professor in 1996 to 97 and received the CCVI Spirit Award for 1999 to 2000. He was the recipient of the Robert Connolly Award for Faculty Leadership in 2017 and 18, and was a past president of the UIW Faculty Senate. Dr. Barnes is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Kansas, where he also received 2 master's degrees and his doctoral degree. His wife, Dr. Karen Barnes, is retired from the faculty of the Department of Occupational Therapy at UT Health Science Center at San Antonio. Their daughter, Ingrid Barnes, is a graduate of Tulane University and UT Law School. She lives with her husband, a Dallas County judge, and stepdaughter in Dallas and practices law there. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Barnes.
Thank you, Leslie, for that very kind, gracious introduction. I'm going to speak this afternoon and show some PowerPoint slides on the Jewish ghettos of the Holocaust. Ghetto life was, in a word, beyond miserable. Overcrowding, isolation, segregation, the unsanitary conditions and so forth just made life in any of these multiple ghettos really, really harsh. Disease was all around, particularly typhus. There was hunger, orphaned children, forced labor, enclosed by walls into a very small area. These ghettos saw tens of thousands of people crowded into just ridiculously small living space. This was obviously designed to be quite temporary. The next step was going to be deportation to the killing centers. And death came in a variety of ways. In the ghetto, death came through illness and starvation, suicide, through cold weather, through murder, and of course, eventually, the final solution, extermination. The segregation of Jews into ghettos, into enforced areas, started in Muslim Morocco in areas that were called millas. Forced segregation of Jews in the 14th and the 15th centuries was common throughout Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. Ghetto is the Italian word for foundry, and this really dates from Venice in 1516. The first ghetto in Poland was THRW, which was set up in October of 1939. Okay, and of course, pay attention to the date. That's exactly 1 month after the start of the war. There were more than 1,000 ghettos throughout Soviet Russia and in Nazi-occupied areas. The largest ghetto was Warsaw, with more than 400,000 people, and liquidations began in late 1941. Okay, this map gives you an idea, okay, of where these ghettos were concentrated. And as you can see, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia already had a couple, but in Belarus, Ukraine, but the preponderance of ghettos was in Poland. Okay? And sometimes people will ask, why weren't there established ghettos on this map in Germany? And the answer to that is that Germany did not have a high population of Jews, less than 1% of its population, about 0.75%. And so the ghettos were established where the Jews were residents, and you're looking at where that is. Okay. Here's another map that gives you a sense of the timeline for the establishment of ghettos. The yellow designates ghettos that were established in 1939 to 1941, the first couple of years of the war. Okay, and as you can see, those ghettos were predominantly in Poland. Okay? From 1941 to 1943, the expansion of ghettos spread, okay? And it spread into Ukraine, Belarus, in other words, into Soviet Russia. And those are marked by the white stars. Then there was another wave of ghettos that was established in late 1943-44 in Hungary before the deportations of Hungarian Jews in April, May, June of 1944. And those are marked in black. The largest ghetto populations, Warsaw clearly, with somewhere between 400 and maybe at its very peak, 500,000 persons. we would pronounce this, give it an English pronunciation and call it Lodz. In Polish, it's pronounced Łódź. Łódź had a population of about 205,000. Lviv around 110, Minsk around 100,000, Amsterdam about 100,000, and Budapest in the neighborhood of about 70,000. So huge numbers of people crowded into these areas. Let me talk a little bit about the social organization of the ghetto. Okay, this is the picture you're looking at is a market scene, of course, in Warsaw Ghetto in 1941. Among the many things that you found in the ghetto, okay, the Judenrat was quite prominent. The Judenrat were the Jewish councils, the councils of elders. Okay? They were established by SS General Reinhard Heydrich in 1939. The function of the Judenrat, as dictated by the Nazis, was to receive German orders and implement them in the ghetto. Members of the Judenrat were elected generally by members of the ghetto, and their tasks were impossible. Okay? Their tasks were to conduct census, to draft people for labor, to confiscate valuables, to evacuate apartments, in other words, to begin the process of determining what apartments are evacuated at what time. And I'm using the term evacuation here as the Germans would use it as a euphemism for deportation and killing. Distributing food rations and select people for the death camp transits. Okay? To be a member of the Judenrat put you in an untenable situation. There was no way you could come out of that experience unharmed. There were four patterns of Judenrat action. One was non-cooperation, that is with the Germans, on economic issues. Tough. A second pattern was acquiescence over seizure of property, but not people. Again, very, very difficult. And then a third and a fourth was resignation over the destruction of the community. And the fourth was simply compliance in full with Nazi orders. Members of the Judenrat were in a no-win situation. Here's some pictures from Amsterdam and from Łódź. Judenrat members, you will notice that they're all male, okay? And you'll notice too that they're still at this time dressed in suits and ties. Heinrich Minkowski was head of the Łódź ghetto of the Judenrat. Born in 1877, he died in 1944. He perished in Auschwitz. And it remains to this day a subject of some historical debate over whether Minkowski perished in the gas chambers or whether he was killed by a Sonderkommando in retaliation for his actions as head of the Judenrat. I put a couple of things on here to give you a sense of Minkowski. He industrialized the ghetto because he was convinced that if people in the ghetto produced goods, that was a way of demonstrating their value to the Nazis. And if that value could be demonstrated consistently, then that would be a buffer against extermination. And he had great organizational skills. In the end, I think history judges him in a kind of a harsh way, trying to decide whether Minkowski was a skilled negotiator or whether in the end he served primarily as a collaborator. Adam Shekhinov was the head of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he kept a diary beginning on September 6, 1939. That would be 5 days after the start of the war. And his wife survived with that diary. He was given an order, of course, to start the deportation of Jews and what is called the Gross Axiom of Warsaw, the big action of Warsaw, to start the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he saw this as a task that he just could not do. As he put it, they demand me to kill children of my nation with my own hands. I have nothing to do but die. And that's what he did. He committed suicide. This is just from one study of UNIRAC members to give you a sense of what happened to these individuals. Of 720 in this particular study, almost 3% of them relinquished membership. You almost wonder why that wouldn't be higher. Almost 2% were removed or arrested. 25% were murdered before deportations came. And then over half were murdered on the way to or at one of the 6 extermination camps. I think maybe a little surprisingly, in this study, only 1%, just slightly more than 1% of UNIRAC members committed suicide. Death from natural causes claimed about 3.5%, but 1 out of 8, 12% of the men who comprise these 720 UNIRAC members, 1 out of every 8 survived war, miraculously. Another part of the social structure of the ghetto was the Jewish order police. They were recruited by the UNIRAC, and the size of the ghetto determined the size of the police force. Larger ghettos had more police members, smaller ones had smaller police forces. And I indicated here some of the things that they had to do, some of usual policing activities, direct traffic, supervised garbage collections, supervise sanitation, guard the ghetto walls, okay? Prevent crime, collect taxes, settle disputes. They functioned in a sense alongside with SS supervision, and that too was a very, very difficult job to be a member of the Jewish order police. Okay, so here are some pictures. Enough text for the time being. Okay. Here's a picture of the Łódź or Lodz Jewish police. Okay. Again, this is a Jewish police force that's going to function inside the ghetto as a means of social control. And here's the Warsaw Jewish police. Okay. And you can see overwhelmingly these are men in all cases. Here's a picture of a Jewish policeman checking documents at what appears to be a passageway from the ghetto out and, of course, back. Medical care. What would you do if you got sick? If you were, crowded into an apartment that had 2 bedrooms and you had 18 or 19 people living in this apartment, and you got some kind of contagious disease, where do you go? Well, there was medical care, okay? And this was handled by Jewish doctors and nurses and other medical people. And they had a very difficult time. I listed some of the things that they had to deal with. Tuberculosis, typhus, starvation, spotted fever, lice. And then, of course, you can add to that the other things that happen. Burst appendix, heart attacks, kidney stones, the list goes on and on. Many women suffer amenorrhea, a cessation of menstruation. In February 1942, Nazis prohibited births. Just simply came out and said no Jewish woman in a ghetto is allowed to have a birth. The standard Nazi medical response was to let people die of starvation, let people die of sickness and illness and typhus. Ghetto doctors had to rely upon smugglers to get medicine and vitamins into the ghettos. And then they had to establish makeshift clinics and hospitals. And it was a very, very difficult and stressful thing to do, to be a health care person in a ghetto. And I just indicated here at the end, that men had a higher mortality rate than women. Here's a picture of doctors and nurses in the witch ghetto. Okay. These are people who are registered nurses, RNs, people who have medical degrees, they're MDs, okay? And they are functioning under these awful kinds of circumstances to try to provide medical care to some very, very ill people. Here's a nurse weighing an infant, a scene out of Warsaw. Little child. And then there was food rationing. Okay? And this related too to the kind of job that one had in a ghetto. If you had a job that was deemed essential, that is by the Nazis, okay? If you had some way you were aiding the Nazi war effort in an organized fashion, let's say you were working under factory conditions, making uniforms or creating coats or socks that would go to Nazi soldiers, then you could get more food stamps, more rations than people who were not engaged in those kinds of essential services. And this is, of course, something that is really very important. Just study for a quick second with me, folks. The caloric intake on an average daily basis for a Jewish residence in the ghetto. Jewish officials, members of the order police, members of the Unrat, okay, they would get somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 calories per day. Workers, professionals in the neighborhood of 1,000, and everybody else 300 calories a day. That was all the Nazis were going to provide food for. And as I've indicated here, for the average for a healthy person, okay, is in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day. So you get the picture very obviously here, that intentional, deliberate overworking, starvation, killing of people and letting them just die on the streets, okay, was commonplace. And the Nazis were as content to do that as to allow living victims to have to be rounded up, herded onto the Umschlagsplatz, the loading dock, and loaded onto trains for the deportation to killing centers. If they died through starvation, illness, and disease, the Nazis could care. I'm going to show you a series of pictures here. And sometimes the pictures, they don't need any explanation. These are scenes of victims of the ghetto. Victims. Was there education? Did students go to school? The answer is, well, yes and no. Schools were allowed early in ghetto existences, but by autumn of 1941, all children over the age of 10 were ordered to work and schools were closed, okay? So shortly after the commencement, well, 2 years after the commencement of the war, everybody was pretty much engaged in some type of labor and schools were shut down. However, primary schools and secondary schools operated secretly. And I'll show you some pictures in a second. Classrooms, as you can imagine, were unheated. There were few supplies and illness was rampant, as we would expect. Pupils and teachers learned to hide books. Here's one from the code, a picture of children in school. You see the yellow star on one child's shirt. This is taken in Kovno. So they're trying to save some remnant of normal life. Schools, and as you'll see, there's a couple other things in a minute, were part of that effort to try to keep and let survive some sense of decency in this terrible situation. Here's an underground school, again, a picture taken in Kovno. And a picture of a class of children, all with their yellow stars. We see a couple of adults in this, obviously, probably teachers. This is taken in Amsterdam. Those were all schools that weren't supposed to be operating. And of course, for many residents, the soup kitchen became the primary means by which they were able to get food. Here we see a picture of the soup kitchen in Warsaw. Here's one of the soup kitchen in Łódź. Back to Warsaw for a second. Near primitive conditions, very difficult, not much in the soup either, okay? But generally better than nothing, and nothing being the alternative. The Nazis forbade religious services, so Jews were not able, formally or legally, to have religious services. So prayer services and religious ceremonies were held in secret, which meant they were held in attics, cellars, back rooms, and other various places where they could hide for a small period of time. It's estimated that Warsaw in 1940, okay, saw somewhere in the neighborhood of about 600 Jewish prayer groups. So there was this effort to try to keep religious life alive, okay, and try to keep it moving forward. But as you can sense by the hostility, the resentment, the treatment that these Jewish men are getting from these Nazi soldiers, it's just an unbearable existence. Here's a picture of some boys at a band religious practice. Something that's taking place, that's not supposed to be taking place. And many people are surprised that there was a symphony. Oh, there were symphonies, there were restaurants, there were plays, okay, that happened in the ghetto. People would come together and try to alleviate some of the pain and the suffering of regular ghetto life. And this would be one way of doing that. Here's a picture of Theodore and the Łódź Ghetto Symphony. You know, when you take an entire population of Jewish people, many who start out by living in the ghetto area, okay, and then you bring to that, okay, thousands and thousands of more persons, you're going to find that there's some talent in that group. And you're going to find musicians and doctors and teachers. You're going to find lawyers. You're going to find poets and novelists. And so there's some talent to draw on. And, you know, and that's what we see in this picture. We see incredible musicians, you know, with marvelous skills. We're trying to put those skills to use. And to talk about the Warsaw Ghetto without mentioning Janusz Korczak and his children, I just can't do that. Janusz Korczak, you might make a note of his name, okay, and look him up, or as we say, Google him. He was many things. He was a medical doctor. He directed this orphanage. He wrote children's books, very well-known children's books. He was a poet of sorts. He was an immensely talented man. Okay? here's another picture of his children. He had a huge orphanage that he ran. It was in the very southeastern tip of the Warsaw Ghetto, okay? And when the order was given for the children to be deported, that is to be shipped to Treblinka, where most residents in Warsaw were deported to, okay? Korczak went with his children. And he had a couple of occasions en route where he could have saved his own life. He had one German soldier who recognized him because that German soldier's child had read some of Korczak's books, children's books. And he offered him an out. And Korczak said, no, I'm going with my children. He dressed his children up in their very finest apparel, and he marched them 2 by 2 all the way across the ghetto from south to north to the Umschaltplatz, where they boarded the train. And there was a big marker at Treblinka with the name Korczak on it. It's one of the few stones of the 18,000 at the Treblinka Memorial that actually have a name. It's a very touching picture of Korczak and a young child. It gives you, I think, a sense of the compassion and the basic humanity that this man had. So I wanted to say a few words about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, okay? Note the dates. It was not long lasting. 19 April to 16 May, less than a month in full in 1943, okay? There were 2 organizations, and I will not try to pronounce their names in Polish, but they translate into the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union. One counted in the neighborhood of about 500 fighters. The other counted in the neighborhood of about 250 fighters. Now, I will bet you that the image that comes to mind right away for many of us is that these are men. Hold on to that thought for just a couple of minutes. During this uprising, SS soldiers killed more than 7,000 Jews in Warsaw. Okay, another 7,000 were deported to the killing center of Treblinka. And to emphasize here, when I say killing center, that's different than a concentration camp. Concentration camp, like Majdanek, can be both a killing center and a work center. But a killing center like Treblinka meant that when you arrived, you were dead 60 to 90 minutes later. The purpose of an extermination camp was to receive a shipment of Jews and take them immediately into the gas chambers, all of them, every single one, no exceptions. Young, old, rich, poor, didn't matter. Male, woman, man, woman, child, didn't matter. Okay. And about 42,000 were deported to Majdanek, and the Warsaw Ghetto was pretty much leveled. The Major General Jürgen Stroop was called in to put the ghetto uprising down. Okay, this is a picture of Stroop and other SS henchmen. Stroop is in the middle of this photograph, kind of looking up and just over the head of this other person. At the end of the war, Stroop had a report compiled, and the pictures I'm going to show you here come right out of the Stroop report. And he had this put together in documents for Hitler, Himmler, and a couple of other SS officials. This is referred to as the Stroop report. And as he noted in this report, the Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no more. Well, that is true. After the Great Action, when tens of thousands of Jews were deported to Treblinka, there were still some remnants of fighters in the ghetto. They had gone into hiding. They'd gone into the bunkers, and Stroop was under instructions to level the entire ghetto, just turn it into rubble. and level it completely and kill everybody there. And here we see SS soldiers having rounded up various families of resistance fighters in the ghetto. You see the black smoke, hands raised high. These people are being marched to the train for deportation to Treblinka. Here's some resistance fighters coming out of their bunkers, okay, being forced out by SS soldiers. But you know, I admire. I was going to say I like, and I don't know if I like this because it's so horrible, okay. But I admire the courage and the strength of especially the two women. And one stands immediately in front of an SS rifle with a very stony defiance. Now, Jewish prisoners being taken during the uprising, coming out of a bunker. That's what life was like inside the bunkers. And there was a whole network of these bunkers under the streets, okay? Connected to the sewage systems throughout the entirety of the ghetto. It was a spider web-like network of bunkers that provided, at least momentarily, some safety for Polish resistance. Buildings on fire. The destruction of the ghetto simply took building by building, block by block, until the entire area had been reduced to rubble. Here we see some victims jumping out of windows, committing suicide rather than be overtaken by the fire or caught by the Nazis. Here's a group who are rounded up, facing the walls. Now, look at this picture, okay? Earlier I said, you know, one of the misconceptions is that the resistance, the ghetto resistance came from men, okay? But if you look at this, you're gonna see an awful lot of women's legs in this picture. Women were as prominent among the resistance in the ghetto, okay, as were men. And there's some incredibly heroic stories. This is a picture that is probably one of the most iconic pictures of the Holocaust, okay? Taken of a small child. We don't know who the boy was. We don't have a name to put to this. Over the years, there's been a half a dozen or so grown men, most of them now getting on quite old, who said, oh, that was me. But establishing for certain who that little boy is, we don't know. All we know is that this is one of the famous photographs. The Great Synagogue, as it turned out, one of the cruelties of the ghetto was that when it was established, the Great Synagogue was just outside the wall. So here was a place of worship where the residents of the ghetto could not even go to, even though it was just a matter of about a block and a half away from the wall. But Stroop ordered it destroyed, and he blew it up, dynamited it. And on the right, you see the picture of what remained after that of the Great Synagogue. So let me just show you some pictures here. When I say that the ghetto was reduced to rubble, I think these pictures, without much comment from me, will give you a sense of that. Oh, guess that's the only one we've got. All right. Well, let me go to this next photograph, and that's the Ghetto Fighters Memorial. That's one side of it, the so-called western side. This is in Warsaw, and I've been there. It's a very impressive memorial, okay? Depicts the heroics and the bravery and the self-sacrifice of these Jewish resistance fighters. This is the west side of that memorial, and this is the eastern side of that memorial. Okay. And now let me end with a couple of slides and a note of hope. This is German Chancellor, or West German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, okay, marking the first time that a German chancellor had set foot on Polish soil since the end of the war. 25 years after the war ended, in 1970, there was a conference that Brandt attended in Warsaw, a meeting of many European leaders. And he came, and he went to the memorial, and he carried this gigantic wreath. And everybody expected Chancellor Brandt to give a speech and to say something profound and deep and meaningful. And Willy Brandt certainly had the capacity to give such a speech. But instead, as you see here, he fell to his knees. And this is called the Warsaw Journey flexion, the Knie fall von Warsaw. And another picture. He stayed on his knees for not quite a minute, but for probably in the neighborhood of 45 seconds before he got back up. And as he later wrote, as I stood on the edge of Germany's historical abyss, feeling the burden of millions of murders, I did what people do when words fail. And you know, I think in that moment, okay, 25 years after the end of the war, for me, this is the spot, this is the time, this is the event that marks the birth of the new Germany. Okay? And he probably captured more in terms of a sense of German responsibility and a sense of trying to make right their wrong in this action than he ever would have by giving a speech. Okay? This marked a very important moment. And that's the presentation. And I thank you very much.
Is there significance to the two sides of the memorial, the west and the east?
Yeah.
Is there a significance to why they chose to do the image they did on either side?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Not that I know of. It's a large memorial. It's quite impressive. And if you go into and you know what's represented on both sides, it tells a very dynamic story. Well, thank you very much, one and all. I appreciate your watching and being part of it. And I'll turn this back over to Liz.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. That was extremely informative, and I learned a lot of new things that I had not heard about before today too. So thanks for being with us. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I would also like to thank all of our sponsors that have made this week of programming possible. And I would encourage you to please, if you've tuned in today, please go to our website at www.hmmsa.org/THRW and fill out an evaluation for the presentation that you've been a part of. It helps us to continue bringing high quality educational programming to the community and to students. Again, our thanks. We have 4 more presentations tomorrow, so we do hope that you will tune in, and we look